The air in the Redemption First Union Bank was thick with the scent of old paper sweat and the false promise of security. Dust motes danced in the long shafts of sunlight, slicing through the tall windows, illuminating the worn floorboards and the stoic face of the teller behind the brass grill. Elias Caney stood in line, his hat held respectfully in his hands, the weight of his life savings pressing on his mind. It wasn't much, but it was everything. Years of breaking horses, scouting for the army, and finally scraping a life from a patch of unforgiving land. Enough to buy the breeding pair of cattle he needed, enough to finally turn his solitary ranch into something that might last longer than he would. He shuffled forward, the leather of his boots creaking a quiet complaint. The line was short. A woman in a faded calico dress ahead of him was arguing in a hushed, desperate tone about a loan. Elias stared past her, his gaze landing on his own reflection in the polished wood of the counter. A man of 38 who looked a decade older, his face a map of hard miles and harder memories, his eyes a pale, weary gray. Then the front doors burst open, swinging inward with a violent crack that shattered the drowsy afternoon quiet. Two men filled the doorway, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas. A third followed, taller than the others, moving with an unnerving grace. He wore a fine black coat, strangely clean for this part of the country, and his bandana was a deep crimson. The only thing louder than the collective gasp of the bank's patrons was the metallic click of hammers being cocked. "Ladies and gentlemen," the man in the crimson bandana announced, his voice smooth and clear, carrying an almost theatrical authority. "This is a redistribution of wealth. Your cooperation will ensure it is a swift and painless one." Panic, sharp and acrid, flared through the room. The woman in calico screamed. One of the robbers, a burly man with a shotgun, slammed the butt of his weapon against the counter. "Quiet," he roared. The scream died in her throat, replaced by a choked sob. Elias instinctively dropped into a crouch, his hand moving toward the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. Years of training of ambushes and firefights screamed at him to act. But he wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a rancher, a civilian surrounded by other civilians. Drawing his weapon would turn a robbery into a massacre. He held still, his muscles coiled tight as a spring. The leader, the man in the black coat, strode to the center of the room, his movements calm, almost elegant. His eyes, a startlingly bright blue above the crimson cloth, scanned the faces of the terrified customers. On the floor, he commanded, his voice never rising. "Now!" People scrambled, dropping to their knees, their hands covering their heads. Elias moved with them, lowering himself to the dusty floorboards, his gaze never leaving the leader. He felt the familiar cold knot of dread in his stomach, the one that always preceded violence. The two henchmen moved quickly, uncovering the door, while the other vaulted the counter, shoving the teller aside and stuffing thick wads of cash into a canvas sack. The leader, however, seemed uninterested in the money. He walked along the line of prone customers, his boots silent on the wood. He was looking for something else. His eyes stopped on Elias. Elias felt the man's gaze like a physical touch, cold and assessing. The leader took a slow step closer, then another. He crouched down, bringing his face level with Elias's. The scent of leather and expensive cologne was jarringly out of place. "You're not like the others," the man said, his voice a low murmur. "You're not afraid. Just waiting." He tilted his head, a gesture of idle curiosity. "What are you waiting for, friend?" Elias said nothing, his jaw set like stone. He met the man's blue eyes, refusing to look away. A flicker of something, amusement perhaps, or irritation, crossed the robber's features. He reached out and, with the barrel of his silver-plated revolver, casually lifted the silver chain that hung around Elias's neck. Dangling from the end was a small oval locket. It was dented and tarnished with age, its surface worn smooth from countless years of being held. Inside was a faded miniature portrait of his wife, Sarah, taken a lifetime ago before the fever had stolen the light from her eyes. It was the only thing of her he had left. A sentimental man. The robber mused, his voice laced with a faint mocking sympathy. He hooked the pistol barrel under the chain and yanked. The silver links bit into Elias's skin and then snapped. A raw animal rage, white-hot and blinding, surged through Elias. He moved without thinking, lunging upward, his hands reaching for the man's throat. But the leader was faster. The world exploded in a flash of white pain as the heavy pistol crashed against the side of Elias's head. He hit the floor hard. Dust and smoke filled his lungs. The sharp, coppery taste of blood flooded his mouth. Through a swimming, darkening haze, he saw the leader stand up, tucking the locket into his coat pocket as if it were a cheap trinket. "Let that be a lesson in patience," the man said calmly to the room at large. He gave a sharp nod to his men. "We're done here." They were gone as quickly as they had come, melting back into the sun-bleached street, leaving behind a silence broken only by the whimpering of the customers and the ringing in Elias Kane's ears. He pushed himself onto his elbows, his head throbbing with a brutal, pulsing rhythm. The canvas sack of money was gone. His life savings were gone. But that wasn't the wound that bled. He could feel the empty space against his chest, a cold spot where the locket had rested for 15 years. They hadn't just stolen his money. They had stolen his ghost. They had stolen his soul. And as he lay on the floor of the Redemption First Union Bank, a promise took root in the blood and the dust. He would get it back. The sun was a merciless hammer against the cracked earth. For 3 months, Elias Caney had lived with the ghost of that robbery. His ranch, a lonely speck of determination in a vast, indifferent landscape, felt emptier than ever. The wound on his temple had healed into a faint, pale scar. But the other wound, the one on the inside, remained raw. He worked from before dawn until long after dusk, his hands raw from mending fences, his back screaming from clearing rock, trying to exhaust the anger that simmered just beneath his skin. But every night in the suffocating silence of his one-room cabin, he would reach for the phantom weight of the locket and find only emptiness. The face of the man in the crimson bandana, the calm voice, the cruel blue eyes, was burned into his memory. He had given his description to the sheriff, a man whose weary competence was perpetually eroded by the sheer size of the territory he had to cover. There were rumors, whispers of a slick, well-dressed gang hitting banks and stages across the state, led by a man they called the Preacher for his eloquent pronouncements. But they were ghosts, leaving behind few clues and fewer witnesses willing to talk. The trail had gone cold. Now Elias was in redemption for supplies the town a necessary evil he endured for salt flour and coffee. The scorched air shimmered above the wide, dusty main street, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the boundless, unforgiving sky. He tied his horse to the hitching rail outside the general store, his movements economical and grim. That's when he saw him. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered near the new livery stable, its fresh pine glowing yellow in the harsh light. At its center stood a man in a tailored black coat, gesturing expansively as he spoke to the mayor. He was laughing, a confident, charming sound that carried across the street. Even from a distance, Elias recognized the posture, the easy grace. His blood ran cold. The man turned, and the sun caught his face. He was clean-shaven now, his dark hair neatly combed. But the eyes were the same, a piercing, unforgettable blue. It was him, the leader of the bank robbers. But he wasn't acting like a wanted man. He was acting like he owned the town. People tipped their hats to him. The mayor clapped him on the shoulder. A sign freshly painted hung above the livery Cane and Sons stables. Redemption's future. Elias felt a disorienting wave of disbelief. Cain. The man had the gall to use a name so close to his own. He watched as a young Apache woman emerged from the stable carrying a heavy bucket of water. She moved with a quiet, practiced subservience, her head down, her long black hair obscuring her face. Her deerskin dress was clean, but worn thin, a testament to long hours of hard labor. The man Silas Cain stopped talking and turned to her. The charming smile vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "Nia," he said, his voice no longer warm, but clipped and sharp. "I told you to use the trough out back. You know our customers don't care to see this." He gestured vaguely at her emotion of dismissal. The young woman Nia flinched, but said nothing. She tried to turn, but the bucket was heavy, and she sloshed some water onto the dusty ground near Silas Cain's polished boots. His face hardened. "Clumsy girl," he snapped, his voice low, but carrying a distinct menace. He reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Look what you've done. Now clean it up." He gave her a little shove, and she stumbled, catching her balance just before she fell. The public humiliation was a clear, brutal display of power. The townspeople looked on, some with pity, most with the practiced indifference of those who knew better than to interfere with a powerful man's business. But Elias saw more than that. He saw the subtle cruelty, the enjoyment Silas took in her fear. And then he saw it. As Silas Cain grabbed Nia's arm, his fine black coat fell open. Hanging from a leather cord around his neck, resting against the crisp white of his shirt, was a small silver oval-shaped locket. The world seemed to contract around Elias until there was only that glint of tarnished silver. His locket. Sarah's locket. Worn like a trophy by the man who had stolen his future and his past, a man now masquerading as the town's benefactor. The cold, patient rage that had been simmering for 3 months finally boiled over. Elias forgot where he was. He forgot the crowd, the mayor, the consequences. He moved. He crossed the street in a dozen long, furious strides, his boots kicking up clouds of dust. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face was enough to make the crowd part before him like water. Silas Cain looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise as Elias bore down on him. "Can I help you, friend?" he asked, a hint of his old mocking tone returning. Elias didn't answer. He reached out his hand, closing not on Silas, but on the locket. He ripped it from the man's neck, the leather cord snapping. The silver felt cold and alien in his palm. It was his, but it felt tainted. Silas's charm evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure fury. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he snarled. "Taking back what's mine." Elias growled, his voice a low rumble of contained violence. He held up the locket. "You'll remember this." For a split second, recognition and something like fear flashed in Silas's blue eyes. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by practiced outrage. He looked at the mayor, at the assembled crowd, and laughed a short, incredulous bark. "This man is mad." Silas declared, his voice ringing with indignation. "This is a keepsake from my sainted mother. He's trying to rob me in broad daylight." Nia, forgotten in the confrontation, stared at Elias, her dark eyes wide with a mixture of terror and something else, a flicker of dawning hope. "He's a liar." Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous. He took a step toward Silas. "And a thief." Sheriff Silas bellowed, not taking his eyes off Elias. "Sheriff, arrest this man." The moment was broken. The spell of confrontation shattered. The crowd, which had been watching with rapt attention, now shifted their loyalties, siding with the man who brought money and progress to their town, not the grim, silent stranger accusing him of a crime. The town sheriff, a man named Miller, pushed his way through the crowd, his hand resting on his sidearm. Caney Miller said, his voice heavy with resignation, "What's the meaning of this?" "This man Elias," said, pointing at Silas, "is the one who robbed the bank 3 months ago." A gasp went through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Silas Kane just shook his head, a look of sorrowful pity on his face. "Sheriff, the man is clearly unwell. I won't press charges for the assault, but he needs to be locked up before he hurts someone." It was a masterful performance. Silas had turned the entire situation around, painting Elias as the aggressor, the lunatic. Elias looked from Silas's smug face to the suspicious eyes of the townsfolk, and he knew he had lost. He had let his rage get the better of him, and now he was trapped. But as Sheriff Miller stepped forward to take his arm, Elias glanced one last time at Nia. She was looking not at him, but at Silas Kane, and in her eyes, for just an instant, he saw a reflection of his own hatred. She knew. She knew what kind of man Silas truly was. And in that shared silent recognition, a desperate, unspoken alliance was forged. The jail cell was a cramped box of iron bars and cold stone smelling of stale sweat and despair. Elias sat on the edge of the hard cot, the recovered locket clutched in his fist. He had it back, but it felt like a hollow victory. Outside, he could hear the town buzzing with the news. Silas Kane, the generous investor, attacked in the street by a crazed rancher. The story had already set like cement. Sheriff Miller appeared at the bars, shaking his head. "You made a powerful enemy today, Elias." "He's a bank robber and a killer," Elias stated, his voice devoid of emotion. "He's the man who's building a new church and paying top dollar for local grain," Miller countered wearily. "And you're a man who keeps to himself and has a reputation for a short temper. Who do you think they're gonna believe?" The truth of it settled like a shroud. Silas hadn't just stolen money. He had stolen the town's trust, twisting it into a shield for himself and a weapon against anyone who might expose him. The hours crawled by. As dusk painted the sky in strokes of rust and ochre, Silas Kane himself appeared, flanked by the mayor and 2 burly men Elias recognized as ranch hands from Silas's spread. Silas's face was a mask of magnanimous concern. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "I've been thinking. It's a tragedy what's become of Mr. Kane. But locking him up won't solve anything. It's clear he's a danger to himself and others." He paused for dramatic effect. "And frankly, after what happened this morning, I'm worried for my own property. I discovered this evening that a dozen head of my prime cattle are missing. Last seen wandering toward the northern range, right where Mr. Kane's land is." Elias stood up, his hands gripping the bars. "You lying son of a—" "There you see," Silas said, turning to the mayor with a sad shake of his head. "The rage is just under the surface. A man like that desperate for money after losing his savings. It's not hard to imagine him turning to rustling. It was a perfect trap. A respected citizen's word against a reclusive outsider's." Sheriff Miller looked cornered, the weight of the town's most influential man pressing down on him. "We'll look into it in the morning," Mr. Kane Miller said, his voice strained. Morning might be too late. One of Silas's men sneered. "Rustlers don't wait around." The threat was clear. They weren't planning on waiting for the law. A lynch mob. Quick, dirty, and final. Elias looked into Silas's cold blue eyes and saw his own death reflected there. This was the end game. Not just to get the locket back, but to erase Elias completely. As they left, the silence in the jailhouse was heavier than before. Elias knew he wouldn't live to see the sunrise. He tested the bars, but they were solid iron set deep in the stone. He was trapped. Late that night, when the town had fallen into a deep, moonless slumber, a shadow detached itself from the alley across from the sheriff's office. It moved with a fluid grace, keeping to the darkest corners. It was Nia. She slipped up to the side window of the jail, a small dark opening just large enough for a whisper. "Cowboy," she hissed, her voice barely audible. Elias moved to the window, his heart pounding. "What are you doing here? They'll kill you if they find you." "They'll kill you if I don't," she countered, her voice fierce. "Silas's men are drinking at the saloon. They're talking about a necktie party before dawn." In her hand, she held a long, thin piece of metal, a shiv fashioned from a barrel hoop. "I saw the deputy leave this on the desk. He uses it to pick the lock on the supply cabinet. Maybe it works on your door." She slid the metal through the bars. Her fingers brushed his, and for a second, they held on. Her skin was cool, her grip surprisingly strong. "Why, Elias," whispered, his voice rough, "why are you helping me?" "Because I know what he is," she said, her voice trembling with a long-suppressed rage. "He promised my people food for the winter if I came to work for him. An indenture, he called it. But it is slavery. He beats the horses, he cheats the men who work for him, and he looks at me like I'm dirt beneath his boot. You were the first person I've seen stand up to him. If you die, my last hope dies with you." Elias's fingers closed around the metal shiv. The lock was old, the mechanism simple. It took 10 agonizing minutes of scraping and probing, the sound of the metal on metal seeming to echo through the silent town. Every creak of a floorboard from the saloon down the street sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through him. Finally, with a dull, satisfying clunk, the lock gave way. He pushed the cell door open and crept into the main office. Nia was waiting for him at the back door, which she had already unlatched. His gun belt was in the evidence locker. No time for that. "My horse is behind the general store," Elias whispered. "His is in the livery. We'll need 2. "No," she said, shaking her head. "His stables are guarded. My horse is hidden a mile out of town. We take yours and run." They slipped out into the cold night air, moving like ghosts through the sleeping town. The sounds of raucous laughter from the saloon spurred them on. They were running out of time. They reached Elias's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding who nickered softly at his approach. "There's a cabin," Elias said, swinging into the saddle. "My cabin. It's remote. We can hide there." He reached down and pulled her up behind him, her arms wrapping around his waist for balance. She was light, but he could feel the wiry strength in her grip. They urged the horse into a gallop, leaving the sleeping town of Redemption behind. As they crested the first hill, Elias looked back. Lights were bobbing in the street now, torches. The lynch mob had formed. They had escaped, but it was not an ending. It was a beginning. They were fugitives now, bound together by a shared enemy and a desperate fight for survival. The ride to Elias's cabin was a frantic, punishing journey through the dark. The buckskin, pushed to its limit, thundered across the hardpan desert, its breath coming in ragged bursts. Nia held on tightly, her body pressed against Elias's back, a silent, tense presence. They didn't speak, conserving their energy, listening for the sound of pursuit that thankfully never came. They reached the cabin just as the first pale gray light of dawn began to bleed across the eastern horizon. It was a simple, solid structure of rough-hewn logs, tucked into a small canyon carved by a seasonal creek. It was a place built for solitude, not for siege. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of pine and old wood smoke. Elias slid off the horse and helped Nia down. She stumbled, her legs stiff from the long ride, and he steadied her with a hand on her arm. For a moment, she leaned against him, a tremor of exhaustion running through her. "Easy," he said quietly. She nodded, pulling away as soon as she found her balance. Her eyes wide and dark in the dim light, swept across the Spartan interior, a stone hearth, a single bed, with a neatly folded blanket, a rough table, and his rifle propped near the door. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. Elias lit the lamp on the table, casting a warm, flickering glow that pushed back the shadows. He saw then how young she was, younger than he'd thought. Her face was smudged with dust, her deerskin dress torn at the shoulder from the frantic escape. But her expression was one of fierce, unyielding resolve. "They will come looking," she said. It wasn't a question. "I know." Elias moved to the water bucket, his body aching. "But not yet. They'll search the main roads first. They won't think I'd be stupid enough to run to my own land. It gives us a day. Maybe two." He poured water into a tin cup and handed it to her. She drank deeply, her throat working. When she was done, she looked at the rifle by the door, then back at him. "You know how to use one of those?" he asked. She shook her head. "My people were taught to use bows for hunting, not guns for fighting." Her jaw tightened. "Silas Kane does not permit us to own firearms." "Then I'll teach you," he said simply. A tense alliance formed in the quiet confines of the cabin. They were two strangers thrown together by circumstance, their only common ground a shared enemy. The first day was spent in near silence, their movements careful and guarded. Elias showed her where he kept the spare food sacks of beans and flour jars of dried meat. He gave her his only spare shirt, a thick flannel that swallowed her small frame, while he set about mending the tear in her dress with a needle and gut thread. Nia, in turn, proved her worth in ways he hadn't expected. While he reinforced the cabin door with a heavy bar, she disappeared into the scrubland around the canyon. She returned an hour later with her hands full of roots and leaves he didn't recognize. For wounds, she explained, seeing his questioning look. "And this one," she held up a pale, gnarled root. "If you boil it, it makes a tea that helps you stay awake. We will need it for the watches." They worked through the day, fortifying their small sanctuary. As the sun began to set, casting long, menacing shadows across the canyon floor, Elias knew he couldn't just wait for Silas to find them. He had to know who he was truly fighting. A man like Silas Kane didn't appear out of nowhere with a fortune to build stables and buy mares. "I have to ride out," he told her, stacking the last of the firewood inside the door. "There's a county records office in Stone Creek 2 days east. It's a long shot, but I need to see who owned this land before Silas did. I need to know where he came from." Nia's expression hardened. "You would leave me here alone?" "It's the only way. If I can find something, some piece of his past, I might be able to find a weakness." He looked at her, his gaze direct. "I taught you how to load the rifle. Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. Fire a warning shot if you see riders. I'll be back before they even know I'm gone." She stared at him for a long moment, a silent battle of fear and trust playing out in her eyes. Finally, she gave a single sharp nod. He left her with the rifle and half their water. Riding east under the cover of a sliver of moon, Elias felt a strange unease. He was used to being alone, had cultivated it for years. But leaving her behind, a lone woman with a rifle she barely knew how to use, felt like a betrayal of some unspoken promise. The 2 days to Stone Creek were a blur of hard riding and cold camps. The town was larger than Redemption, a dusty hub of commerce and law. At the county courthouse, a stuffy book-filled room presided over by a clerk with ink-stained fingers, Elias began his search. He started with the land deed for the ranch Silas had bought. The previous owner was a family who had moved to California. The sale was clean paid for in cash. A dead end. He spent the rest of the day poring over old newspapers and military archives looking for any mention of Silas Kane. Nothing. It was as if the man had sprung into existence 6 months ago. Frustrated, Elias was about to give up when a thought struck him. He wasn't just looking for Silas Kane. He was looking for a man with bright blue eyes and a history of violence. He turned to the military records, specifically the rosters from his own time in the cavalry during the brutal campaigns against the Apache. He scanned the names page after page of young men, many of whom never came home. And then he found it. Not Silas Kane, but a name that made the hair on his arms stand up. Private Daniel Younger. A boy of 18 fresh from the East, with a note in his file from his commanding officer Elias himself, commending his bravery. And next to the name in the section for identifying features, eyes blue. Elias remembered the boy. Eager, fearless, always talking about his younger brother back home who looked up to him, a brother he was sending all his pay to. A brother named Silas. Daniel Younger had died during the Red Creek engagement. It hadn't been an engagement. It had been a massacre. A command miscommunication, a botched charge into a box canyon. Elias had given the order, an order based on faulty intelligence from his superiors. They had ridden straight into an ambush. Daniel Younger had been one of the first to fall shot from his horse just a few feet from where Elias fought. The memory was a scar on his soul, the deepest of the many he carried. His hands shaking, Elias pulled another file, the casualty reports. Daniel Younger, deceased, next of kin, Silas Younger brother. Elias stared at the name, the pieces clicking into place with a horrifying certainty. Silas Kane was Silas Younger. The bank robbery wasn't random. Stealing the locket wasn't just cruelty. Framing him for rustling wasn't just a convenience. It was all personal. A deep, calculated, and patient revenge plotted for years. Silas wasn't after money. He was after Elias's life, his reputation, his soul, everything he had to pay for the brother Elias had led to his death. The fight wasn't about justice anymore. It was about ghosts. The ride back to the cabin was a desperate race against time and memory. The ghost of Daniel Younger rode with him, his eager, youthful face superimposed over the harsh landscape. Every canyon pass, every rocky outcrop reminded Elias of that fatal day at Red Creek. He had spent years trying to bury that memory, and now Silas had dug it up and was using it as a weapon. He found the cabin silent and dark, his heart hammering against his ribs with the fear of what he might find. He gave the low whistle they had agreed upon as a signal. A moment later, the bar on the door scraped back and Naya opened it, the rifle held steady in her hands. She lowered it when she saw it was him, relief washing over her face. "You were gone a long time," she said, her voice tight. "I found him," Elias said, stepping inside. He told her everything, the name, the brother, the massacre at Red Creek. He watched her face as he spoke, expecting to see condemnation, a new layer of fear. He was, after all, the man who had led the charge that day. But her expression was one of grim understanding. "He is a man driven by a ghost," she said quietly. "Those are the most dangerous kind." She looked at him, her dark eyes searching his. "Your ghost is a brother you could not save. His is a brother he could not avenge. They are the same." Her insight struck him. She saw the twisted symmetry of it, the shared poison of the past that now connected him and Silas. In that moment, the last of the walls between them crumbled. They were no longer just allies. They were two people trapped in the same terrible story. His discovery changed everything. They weren't just hiding anymore. They were waiting for a man consumed by vengeance, a man who would stop at nothing. Silas wouldn't send the sheriff next time. He would send killers. He'll know I went to Stone Creek, Elias reasoned, pacing the small cabin. He'll have someone watching the courthouse. He knows that I know. Then he will come soon, Nia said, her hand resting on the stock of the rifle. They had less than a day. The attack came at dusk. Elias was on watch, positioned on the ridge overlooking the cabin, when he saw them, 4 riders moving carefully through the twilight, their rifles glinting in the last rays of sun. They weren't a posse. They were bounty hunters, hard men who killed for money. Silas had raised the stakes. Elias scrambled back to the cabin. "They're here," he said, his voice low and urgent. 4 of them. Nia's face was pale but set. She took her position at the small window on the west wall, the rifle resting on the sill. Elias took the front door, his Colt feeling heavy and familiar in his hand. The siege began. The first shot splintered the wood of the cabin door, forcing Elias to drop to the floor. Outside, the men spread out, using the rocks and trees for cover. They were professionals. "They're trying to draw our fire," Elias yelled over the crack of gunfire. "Don't shoot until you have a clean shot." The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the canyon into a treacherous gloom. The gunfire became sporadic, a deadly waiting game. Hours passed. The air in the cabin grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Suddenly, a new sound, a scraping, scrabbling noise from the roof. "They're on the roof," Nia cried out. "They're trying to start a fire." One of the hunters had climbed the rock face behind the cabin. He was trying to get to the stovepipe to drop oil-soaked rags down into their sanctuary. Elias knew he had to act. "Cover me," he yelled to Nia. He burst out the front door, firing his Colt into the darkness to draw their attention. 2 of the hunters returned fire bullets, whining past his head, chewing up the dirt at his feet. It was the distraction Nia needed. She leaned out the west window, aimed the rifle upward, and fired. A pained scream echoed from the roof, followed by the heavy thud of a body sliding down the shingles and hitting the ground. 1 down. Enraged, the remaining hunters laid down a volley of suppressive fire, pinning Elias behind a rocky outcrop. He was trapped. He saw a flicker of movement to his left. One of the men was trying to flank him. Elias fired twice, the muzzle flashes briefly illuminating the man's snarling face before he crumpled behind a juniper bush. 2 down. But the third man had seen his chance. He rose from behind his cover and charged the cabin door, hoping to end it while Elias was pinned down. Nia was faster. She swung the heavy rifle around the barrel, resting on the doorframe. She didn't have time to aim properly. She just fired. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space. The charging man was thrown backward, a dark stain spreading across his chest. 3 down. Silence descended on the canyon, absolute and ringing. Elias waited, his heart pounding, listening for the 4th man. Nothing. After a long, tense minute, he heard the sound of a horse galloping away in the distance. The last hunter had lost his nerve and fled. It was over. Elias stumbled back into the cabin, his ears ringing, his hands shaking from the adrenaline. Nia was leaning against the wall, the heavy rifle clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. Her face was stark in the lamplight, her eyes wide with shock and the terrible, grim triumph of survival. He crossed the room and gently took the rifle from her hands, propping it against the wall. Then he reached out and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for only a second before collapsing against him, her body trembling. He held her, his hand stroking her hair, the smell of gunpowder clinging to them both. They had survived. They had fought together, and they had won. But they both knew this wasn't the end. The failed attack would only make Silas more desperate, more dangerous. The final confrontation was coming. A suffocating stillness fell over the canyon in the days following the siege. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. Elias buried the bounty hunters in shallow, unmarked graves, a grim task that felt like digging his own. The fourth man would have returned to Silas, confirming Elias Caney was not a man to be trifled with, and that the Apache girl was no mere victim. They knew Silas's next move would be his last. The world outside their small fortress began to change. The sky turned a sickly yellowish gray, and the air grew thick and heavy, charged with a strange electricity. A sandstorm was coming. A big one. The kind that could strip paint from a wagon and flay the skin from a man. He will use the storm. Nia said, her voice quiet as she watched the horizon from the cabin door. He will think we are trapped, blinded. He will come for us himself. No, Elias said, cleaning his rifle with meticulous, steady hands. He won't come here. He's a performer. He wants an audience. Elias looked toward the distant smudge on the horizon that was the town of Redemption. He'll force us back there. He wants to destroy me in front of the people he fooled. He wants to finish this where it began. His words proved prophetic. That afternoon the well ran dry. Sabotaged. The creek bed, their last resort, was already a ribbon of cracked mud. Silas had cut them off, using his knowledge of the land to leave them with a single desperate choice: stay and die of thirst, or ride into the teeth of the storm and face him in town. They left at dawn the next day, the wind already a low, mournful howl. They rode with their heads down, bandanas pulled over their faces against the stinging, swirling sand. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of brown and gray. The sun was a pale, forgotten coin in the sky. Redemption was a ghost town when they arrived. Doors were shuttered, windows barred. The wind screamed down the main street, tearing at the signs, piling sand and drifts against the buildings. The only light shone from the saloon, a beacon in the tempest. It was the only place large enough to hold everyone seeking shelter. It was the stage Silas had set. They pushed through the swinging doors, the storm roaring in behind them before they could slam them shut. The saloon was packed and the air thick with the smell of wet wool whiskey and fear. The townspeople, the mayor, Sheriff Miller, the shopkeepers, the ranch hands, were huddled at tables, their faces pale and anxious. And at the bar, standing alone, a glass of whiskey in his hand, was Silas Kane. He turned as they entered, a slow, deliberate motion. A thin, triumphant smile touched his lips. His fine clothes were immaculate, untouched by the storm. He had been waiting for them. Elias, he said, his voice cutting through the nervous murmur of the crowd. And the lovely Nia. I'm so glad you could make it. I was worried you might miss the final act. Elias walked toward him. Nia, a step behind her hand, never far from the knife tucked in her belt. The townspeople stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and fear. It's over, Silas Elias said, his voice low and steady. Or younger, whichever name you prefer. A ripple of shock went through the room. Silas's smile didn't falter. He took a sip of his whiskey. So the old scout did his homework. Yes, my name is Silas Younger. And you, he said, his voice dropping, losing its charm and taking on a raw, venomous edge, are the man who murdered my brother. He turned to the captive audience. This man you see before you, this quiet rancher, is a decorated war hero. Isn't that right, Captain Caney? They gave you medals for your work at Red Creek. But they didn't tell you what the work was, did they? He led a charge into a settlement of old men, women, and children. My brother Daniel was a good and honorable boy. He thought he was serving his country. But this man led him to his death, not in a battle, but in a slaughter. For this, they called him a hero. The saloon was dead silent, save for the howling of the wind outside. Elias felt the weight of every eye in the room. He didn't deny it. It was a mistake, he said, his voice rough with a guilt that had never faded. The intelligence was wrong. We were ambushed. A mistake, Silas laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. My brother is dead because of your mistake. I have spent 10 years planning this. I earned my fortune, I built this town up, all for the sole purpose of tearing you down. I wanted to take everything from you, just as you took everything from me. He set his glass down on the bar with a sharp click. And now, here we are. I'm going to give you a choice, Elias. The choice I was never given. He drew his silver-plated revolver and laid it on the bar. Kill me. Avenge yourself for the money I took for the men you lost at your cabin. Become the murderer I've always known you to be. Or let me walk out of here and live the rest of your life knowing my brother's ghost will follow you to your grave. It was the ultimate trap. To kill Silas would be to prove him right. To let him go would be an unbearable moral failure. As Elias stood frozen by the terrible choice, it was Nia who moved. She stepped forward, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the tense silence. He is not the only one who lost someone at Red Creek. Every head turned to her. She looked directly at Elias, her eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. My village was at Red Creek, she said, her voice shaking but unbroken. My father and my uncle died that day, fighting to protect our homes from your soldiers. Your mistake made me an orphan. It drove my people from their land and left us to starve. The man who killed your brother, she said, turning her burning gaze on Silas, is the same man whose actions destroyed my entire world. The second twist landed like a physical blow. The story wasn't just about Elias and Silas anymore. It was about her too. They were all three of them tied to the same moment ghosts of the same tragedy. Nia looked back at Elias, her expression softening. But you are not that man anymore. That man was a soldier following orders. The man standing here saved me. He protected me. He is not the monster this man wants him to be. She turned to Silas, her voice ringing with contempt. You speak of your brother's ghost, but you are the one who has desecrated his memory. You have become a thief and a killer, all in the name of a grief you've twisted into hatred. Your brother would be ashamed of you. Her words shattered Silas's composure. His face contorted in a mask of pure rage. You shut your mouth, he screamed, lunging for the gun on the bar. But Elias was already moving. He didn't draw his own weapon. He lunged forward, slamming Silas against the bar, his forearm pressing against the man's throat. Silas struggled, his face turning purple, his hands clawing at Elias's arm. The choice was there, stark and simple. A little more pressure and it would all be over. Vengeance would be his. He looked past Silas's enraged face and met Nia's eyes. He saw the trust there, the belief in the man he had become, not the man he had been. He saw the chance for redemption. With a guttural roar, Elias shoved Silas away. Silas stumbled backward and fell to the floor, gasping for air. Elias stood over him, his chest heaving, but his hands were empty. He had made his choice. The spell was broken. The storm outside seemed to lessen its fury. Sheriff Miller, his face grim, stepped forward with his gun drawn. Silas Younger, he said, his voice firm. You're under arrest for bank robbery and for the murder of 3 men at Caney's ranch. The townspeople, having seen the truth of Silas's obsessive, cruel heart, didn't move to defend him. They simply watched as the man who had promised them a future was revealed to be nothing more than a slave to the past. As quickly as it had arrived, the sandstorm passed. The wind died down, leaving behind a world scoured clean and eerily silent. The sun broke through the retreating clouds, casting a weak but hopeful light over redemption. In the saloon, the townspeople began to emerge, blinking in the sudden brightness, their faces etched with the night's revelations. Silas Younger sat in a chair, his hands bound, his head bowed. The charm and fury were gone, replaced by a hollow, defeated emptiness. He didn't look up as Sheriff Miller and 2 deputies led him away to the jail cell Elias had recently occupied. The town that had once revered him now watched him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They had been fooled, and the truth was a bitter pill. Elias stood by the saloon's shattered window watching the street. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion settled over him. Nia came to stand beside him. Her arm was bandaged where a shard of flying glass had cut her a small injury in a battle of much deeper wounds. "It's over," she said softly. He nodded, not looking at her. The part with him is. The unsaid words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Their shared history, the tragedy of Red Creek that had unknowingly bound their lives together long before they met, was now a chasm that lay open at their feet. They left the saloon without a word to anyone, and walked to the livery to retrieve their horse. The journey back to the cabin was made in a fragile silence. The landscape, freshly washed by the storm, seemed new and raw, much like the emotions churning within them. That evening, they sat at the rough table in the cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The intimacy they had built forged in shared danger and quiet trust now felt strained under the weight of the full truth. Finally, Elias spoke, his voice low and raspy. "I can't change what happened that day, Nia. I was a captain in the cavalry. I followed my orders. I led those men, and I live with what we did every day of my life." He looked up, his gray eyes filled with a pain that went deeper than any physical wound. "Your father, your people. I am sorry. That word isn't enough, but it's the only one I have." Nia listened, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her face was a mask of conflicting emotions. "I know you are," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I saw it in your eyes in the saloon. You have carried that fight for as long as Silas Younger has carried his. The difference is, you did not let it turn you into a monster." She paused, taking a deep, shaky breath. "When I was a girl, my grandmother told me that some wounds are too deep to heal alone. They become a part of the land, a part of the people. Red Creek is a part of me, and it is a part of you. The question is, can 2 broken pieces of the same tragedy make a whole?" He didn't have an answer. He looked around the small cabin at the life he had built to keep the world out, a fortress against his own past. And he looked at her, the woman who had breached its walls and shown him that hiding was not the same as healing. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. "But I think I want to try." A single tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. She simply nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of acceptance. The conversation was over. The hard truth was laid bare between them. Now all that was left was the choice of what to do with it. In the days that followed, a quiet, deliberate healing began. They returned to the ranch not as fugitives or allies of convenience, but as 2 survivors tentatively mapping out a future on the scarred terrain of their past. They spoke little of Red Creek, yet its presence was in everything, in the careful way Elias taught her to manage the land, in the gentle way she tended to the small garden she had started near the creek bed. They were building something new, brick by brick, upon the foundations of their shared trauma. One cool, clear morning, a week after the storm, Elias reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out the silver locket. He had cleaned it, polished it, until the tarnish gave way to a dull, warm shine. He held it in his palm, the weight of it, both a comfort and a burden. He walked over to where Nia was watering her fledgling plants. He opened the locket, revealing the tiny faded portrait of his wife, Sarah. Her smile was a ghost from another life, a memory of a man he no longer was. "This was my wife," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She died a long time ago. I've been carrying her with me ever since, trying to hold on to a past that was gone. I think it's time I let her rest." Nia looked from the picture to Elias's face, her expression full of a profound, quiet understanding. She placed her hand over his, her fingers gently closing his over the locket. Together, without another word, they walked to the base of a young cottonwood tree near the creek. Elias dug a small hole in the soft, dark earth with his hands. He looked at the locket one last time, a silent farewell to the grief that had defined him for so long, and placed it in the ground. Nia helped him push the soil back over it, their hands brushing in the dirt. When they stood up, the space on his chest where the locket used to hang no longer felt empty. It felt free. The burial of the locket was more than a symbolic act. It was a promise. It was the burying of ghosts of vengeance and of a past that could never be changed, but no longer had to be the final word. They turned back toward the cabin, the morning sun warming their faces. The small homestead no longer looked like a lonely outpost. It looked like a beginning. The final scene was not one of grand pronouncements or dramatic kisses, but of a simple shared purpose. Elias picked up an axe to split firewood, the rhythmic thud a steady heartbeat for their new life. Nia returned to her garden, her hands tending to the new growth, coaxing life from the unforgiving soil. They worked side by side, two solitary figures who had found not a cure for their old wounds, but a partner to help carry the scars. They were no longer defined by the tragedy that had connected them, but by the future they were now against all odds building together.